Okay, welcome everyone. Fantastic to see so many friends and newcomers. Jeffrey, Jake, Stuart, good to see you, members of the board. Okay, so welcome. My name is Karen Underhill, member of the board of Chicago YIVO Society, and I am delighted to be able to introduce today's speaker in our series of online talks, Professor Justin Cammy. And before I do, I just want to mention that for those of you who may not know, and for those of you who already do, it can bear repeating that Chicago YIVO Society is a local affiliate, a small local affiliate of New York YIVO, Institute for Jewish Research. And we are an all volunteer organization. And we are funded entirely by donations from our attendees and by enthusiasts. And all the money that you might donate to help us do these events does not go towards any overhead, but only towards bringing wonderful scholars and performers. And today we are delighted that Professor Justin Cammy has made time to be one of our guests. Justin Cammy is a professor of Jewish Studies and World Literatures at Smith College and a leading authority on the Yiddish poet Avrom Sutzkever, a monumental figure within Yiddish literature and culture, and also on the Young Vilna movement and group of Yiddish writers and artists with which Avrom Sutzkever was associated in pre-World War II Vilna. Professor Cammy is editor and translator of a truly remarkable new volume of writings by Sutzkever entitled From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, Memoir and Testimony, published this fall by McGill Queen's University Press. A volume of important, essential, and also surprising and riveting writings, which it's fascinating have not been available in English up till now. And in his talk today, Professor Cammy may touch on some of the reasons why that's been true. Professor Cammy is also editor of the 2009 Arguing the Modern Jewish Canon, Essays on Jewish Literature and Culture, and translator and editor of the 2003 On Long Winter Nights, Memoirs of a Jewish Family in a Galician Township, 1870 to 1900 by Hinda Bergner. He is a vital and incredibly energetic voice in Yiddish studies today, a literary and cultural historian with research and teaching interests in Yiddish literature, Eastern European Jewish history, Zionism, and contemporary Israel, and an inspiring teacher, including at summer programs of Yiddish culture in Tel Aviv and the Yiddish Book Center. He's author of many articles and critical introductions to work by Yiddish writers and memoirists, including the introduction to another recent exciting bilingual volume of poetry by Sutzkever, translated by Richard Fine, published in 2019, The Full Pomegranate. He's also author with Avram Noverstern of a lengthy afterword that I recommend to the volume of translations that he will discuss today. Justin, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm really excited. I'm going to just share my screen for a second. You'll tell me whether you can see my PowerPoint. Yes, no?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you so much. It's great to be virtually in Chicago with the YIVO Society there in Chicago, and with my colleague, the wonderful Karen Underhill, who I think, you know, my fondest memory of you, Karen, is sitting and planning out certain touring routes over breakfast in Jerusalem at a conference that we had. Oh, now it seems so much long ago in the pre-COVID days. Yeah, exactly. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much. I think the way we're going to work today is I'm going to talk for a little bit and show some slides, and then Karen and I are going to have a conversation. And of course, you're more than welcome to insert some questions into the chat or into comments afterwards. So welcome and thank you for coming. Given that this is a YIVO presentation, I thought that I would begin with a short reading from Sutzkever's Ghetto memoir that's situated in YIVO. And it's a chapter called Under the Protection of Esther Rochel Kaminska. And Esther Rochel Kaminska was the really the grandmother of the Yiddish theater. So this is Sutzkever writing about his work in YIVO with the Paper Brigade. I worked in the building that had been the headquarters of the Yiddish Scientific Institute, or YIVO. I was part of the Rosenberg Task Force, which was charged with collecting and pillaging cultural treasures from Vilna's museums and libraries. While I occupied myself with saving cultural treasures, I never forgot that we also had to defend ourselves. The partisan organization was in desperate need of guns, and my friend Shmerke Kaczerginski worked alongside me. We decided to procure a machine gun. Kaczerginski's wife, who was from Krakow, did not look Jewish, and she never entered the ghetto. She passed as a non-Jew and lived in town with a close friend of her husband, a Lithuanian, who furnished her with false papers. I also knew him. His name was Julian Jankauskas. He often arrived at the entrance to YIVO to bring us food and leaflets from the underground organizations. On one occasion, we told him that the ghetto desperately needed weapons. Early the next morning, he bought us a gun. In the period of a single month, he delivered 20 other weapons, pistols, Mausers, 13 Belgian Parabels with 1,000 bullets, and he promised to one day provide us with a machine gun. At 7 in the morning on that specified day, at the time we normally arrive for work, he was supposed to bring it to us. But Jankauskas did not show up. We didn't know what to think. Perhaps the plan had been foiled. 10 o'clock came and went, then 11. Still, he was not there. Even 3 unknown letters by Shalom Aleichem that I fortuitously discovered hidden between pages of a tractate of Talmud could not raise my morale. Dr. Sprinkler, the German theoretician of the Rosenberg Task Force, came to tell us that we should be sure to affix the yellow patches to our clothing. They had to be fastened not only to our outerwear, but also to all shirts and blouses. An important commission from Berlin would be arriving in 2 hours after lunch to inspect the anti-Semitic exhibit that had been installed on the upper floor of YIVO. It was possible that members of the commission would visit other rooms as well. He advised to make ourselves scarce. I was relieved that Jankauskas had not arrived that morning. We wouldn't now have to worry about having weapons in the Institute while a German commission was visiting. I got to work gathering up the scattered index cards of Alfred Landau's Yiddish dictionary. The great philologist had worked for 60 years on the project, but did not live to see it published. After his death, his relatives sent his papers and his private library to YIVO. Now its pages were scattered and trampled on the floor. I gathered them up, put them back in small cardboard boxes, and thought about where I could hide them. Suddenly, I looked out the window and saw Jankauskas. I thought I would have recognized this tall, thin silhouette anywhere, but this time the young man was carrying a large case that I could have fit into myself. Blood beat at my temples. Shmerke and I rushed to the yard to meet Jankauskas. He was waiting and hiding behind a tree. He was sweating. He wiped his face with a handkerchief and told us that he had been unable to come that morning because there had been a search. 300 inhabitants of the surrounding buildings had been arrested and sent to the Gestapo. We were not expecting this. To see him walking the streets of Vilna in the middle of the day with a concealed machine gun in a case, but we had no time to think. The commission from Berlin would be arriving at 2 o'clock. The execution platoon of the SS was located directly across the street from the YIVO building. The 2 of us carried the suitcase down to the basement and buried it under a stack of newspapers. We removed its contents, and I took one piece upstairs to the art storage room so that the machine gun would not be discovered whole. The room was divided by a simple partition, and the space belonged to me, as it were. All of the Jewish art looted from various museums was brought here to me, and I had to register the items, give them a number, and bring them into the storage through a door that connected the 2 rooms. I took the barrel of the gun and hid it under 3 paintings. The one at the bottom, touching the metal of the gun, was a portrait of Esther Rochel Kaminska. It was from the theater collection of YIVO. In the painting, this mother of the Yiddish theater appeared young and pretty, her hair covered by a veil. The second work protecting the gun was one drawn by Chagall. And the third one on top was the famous tableau Refugees by Maurycy Minkowski, the one that had come from the Ansky Museum. The young woman who had run to town came back with awful news. Kittel had come to arrest Wittenberg, commander of the partisan organization. We heard the sound of a car. The commission from Berlin had arrived. 4 crisply dressed Germans alighted. I heard someone open the door to the art storage room, and I felt my heart racing. Blood rushed to my face. Catastrophe was near. They were going to discover the gun. And aside from killing us, the 30 Jews working at YIVO, they would murder all the inhabitants of the ghetto. And who would be responsible for this? Me. How could I have been so careless? What could I do? How could I save my fellow Jews? And what about our youth? I needed to find a solution. A crazy thought suddenly occurred to me. There was no time to think it over. I ran into the art storage room and called out in German, "Pardon me." I then ran out through the second door and returned to my room through the corridor. I hoped to turn their attention away from the art. I wanted them to take me for an idiot, so long as they did not touch the paintings under which the barrel of the machine gun was hidden. I stood by the door and overheard what was going on in the room. My entry had confused them. "Who's that crazy Jew?" A tall German, like an upright serpent, lisped. He took the second piece, the drawing by Chagall, and he explained, "This painter is a Jew who has Judaized European art." My head was about to explode. My throat was as tight as if it were being choked by a fist. The last defense was Esther Rachel Kaminska. She alone was protecting the machine gun. One more second could lead to disaster. I had to act. The wick was burning and the flame was approaching the gunpowder. I opened the door again, pushed my way into the group of Germans, waved my hands hysterically, my face dripping with sweat, and gestured wildly. The Germans could not understand what was going on. Who was this crazy Jew spinning through the room like a demon and then disappearing again? Let's get out of here. So that's an excerpt from Sutzkever's Ghetto Chronicle, and I want to talk about the origins of this chronicle. You see two covers of the book, one on the right published by the Emis Press in Moscow in 1946, and the other published in Paris the same year with slightly different covers, you'll note. One Vilna Ghetto, just Vilna Ghetto, and one of the Vilna Ghetto, or from the Vilna Ghetto. So in the early summer of 1944 in Moscow, then only 31-year-old Avrom Sutzkever drafted what would be his only full-length nonfiction book, a prose account of his 2 years in the ghetto, which he called Von Vilna Ghetto. The memoir would not be published in the Soviet Union until more than a year and a half later, around the same time that this other edition, slightly different, appeared under the imprint of the Association of Vilna Natives in Paris. How did this volume come about? And what can we learn from a text that was composed while war still raged elsewhere, even though the full scope of the local devastation was already evident? Well, of course, Sutzkever was no ordinary witness to the Nazi horrors. He had come of age as a teenager and a young adult in an environment in which the community's leading figures modeled dignity and respect for local Jewish culture. In fact, while he was still a teenager, none other than Max Weinreich, head of the YIVO, had sworn an oath of initiation into the local scouting movement on a hillock overlooking Vilna, in which Sutzkever was asked to, quote, serve Yiddish culture. And through the 1930s, he grew into one of the most exciting voices of the local Yiddish literary scene. Sutzkever spent 2 years in the ghetto, from its very beginning to almost its last day, and then 6 months in the forest before his rescue and arrival in Moscow in late March 1944. It was there that he was asked by none other than the Soviet Jewish writers Ilya Ehrenberg and Vasily Grossman to join the editorial team for the Black Book and to contribute his own essay on the Vilna Ghetto for it. When the authorities intervened a few months and year later, Sutzkever found himself free to publish his essay on his own, accounting for the delay between the time he submitted it in the fall of 1944, after he had returned to liberated Vilna to write a final chapter, and its publication in early 1946. And here we see an image on the left of a Yiddish letter that Sutzkever writes in Yiddish to Ilya Ehrenberg from Vilna in the first weeks after his return to his community. And on the right, an image of Sutzkever at a meeting of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in Moscow soon after his rescue in the spring-summer of 1944. Well, until now, scholars of Sutzkever have paid scant attention to this volume. Despite Sutzkever's reputation as the leading Yiddish poet and editor of the post-war period, the volume played no significant role in discussions of the author's oeuvre. One might even go so far as to claim that Sutzkever himself erased his own memoir from public memory. Though it was translated into Hebrew shortly after its initial publication, in later years, he never sought out its republication in Yiddish, nor its translation, and by ignoring it, he seemed to suggest that everything of value that he had to say about the destruction of Eastern European Jewry had been poured into his lyrics and later into his symbolic prose. The prose memoir seemed consigned to a wartime relic, one that he barely acknowledged. So now, on the 75th anniversary of its initial publication, and on the 75th anniversary of Sutzkever's own testimony at Nuremberg, we have the opportunity to revisit this document and other materials related to this context. When Ilya Ehrenberg published an article about Sutzkever's wartime experiences in Pravda, called The Triumph of a Human Being, his portrait of Sutzkever established the link between art and the resistance it inspired for a vast Soviet readership. How did Sutzkever, so soon after leaving the forest, balance serving multiple masters, the master of language, as he called it elsewhere, the cause of Jewish memory, the expression of Jewish rage, and of course, the desire of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to reshape the Jews' public image as loyal Soviets, all the while creating an act of indictment against the Germans. Perhaps the volume was ignored for so long because it does not fulfill our own contemporary desires, but rather reflect how Sutzkever had to learn to, quote, write Soviet. That is in the style of Soviet reportage, in spare emotion. Sutzkever's poetry, one might argue, communicates so much more experience. Why does the volume, for instance, the memoir, say so little for the context and the composition of his most famous ghetto poems? Why does he not cite his poetry more extensively in the Chronicle, citing only one poem that he wrote? Why does he seem to devote so much more attention to local non-Jews who helped to save Jews instead of local non-Jews who collaborated with the authorities in murdering Jews? Why is it not more critical of decisions made during the ghetto period by the Judenrat, by the Jewish police, by the resistance, or even by himself? Why does he not mention his organization of an evening in the ghetto dedicated to the poetry of the homegrown literary group Young Vilna, of which he was a part? Why is his receipt of a first prize in a literary competition limited to a single line? Why does the murder of his infant son and his mother occupy no less than a very short paragraph? Why are accounts of Sutzkever's own successes as a cultural organizer and actor restrained to an extreme? The underlying thrust of the volume seems to offer a collective rather than a personal, rather than an individual experience of communal life in extremis. And I want to suggest that reading Sutzkever's 1944 Chronicle demands that we leave aside our own desires and understand the text on its own terms. All memoir, of course, is a construction of the self at a particular moment and should be unpacked as such. If his poetry served the angels of art, memoir would serve a much more prosaic, but no less important cause. This is what Sutzkever encountered in late July 1944, when he rushed back from Moscow to witness the ruins of Vilna. You see on the left the ruins of one of the famous landscapes that would have constituted former Jewish areas of the city. And on the right, you see Sutzkever himself in the ruins. How is he supposed to make sense of the devastation while simultaneously crafting an act of indictment against the Germans and beginning to draft what we might think of today as a usable past for not only readers at the time, but for future readers of Yiddish? Well, part of this is found, I think, in the polyvocal nature of the text. Since From the Vilna Ghetto is polyvocal, that is, it's not only Sutzkever's voice, but he brings in the voice of many other people who he interviews. I think it should be appreciated as a very early attempt at translating oral testimony into prose, in which the writer serves as both address, editor, and disseminator of the witnessing of others. As the memoir progresses, it increasingly moves from Sutzkever's voice to the voice of the people at large by providing increased space to the voices of survivor witnesses he encountered upon his return to Vilna in 1944. And by the memoir's final section, his own voice almost disappears in a chapter of firsthand eyewitness accounts. It's almost relentless in this regard. Sutzkever functions here as the intimate, the trusted recipient of testimony, and as the distiller and archivist of collective memory. And in so doing, the memoir becomes an early attempt to craft a collective voice of Holocaust testimony. In extending this text to include multiple voices, the author, I think, was positioning himself to emerge as the figure who possessed the authority by virtue of his reputation to gather, to select, to synthesize, and ultimately to narrate the experiences of his community, a strategy that would then provide him with legitimacy to be selected later to testify on behalf of Soviet Jewry at the Nuremberg Trials in February 1946. So Sutzkever's memoir or chronicle really privileges two things. We might think of, on the one hand, it privileges the organizational and cultural resistance of the Jewish community. On the other hand, there's a whole section there on the armed resistance, on the United Partisan Organization. That is, he tries to craft a narrative of ghetto life as a way to counterbalance, I think, its final chapter on liberation, which, although it's about perhaps the city's liberation, ultimately is about how little of Jewish Vilna remained. Since these sections on communal endurance are bookended by other sections on murder, on humiliation, and ultimately on annihilation, the memoir is haunted by this unreconcilable tension, namely that the cultural and physical resistance that he himself was so deeply invested in had proved unable to save most of his community, including his infant child and mother. If the ghetto lyrics he was editing in Moscow served the higher Jewish need for a mythopoetics of Jewish catastrophe and heroism, to satisfy his Soviet hosts, I think he would write a straightforward war reportage that met the need for evidence of Nazi crimes and of Jewish resistance to fascism. So we see here on the slide that I'm providing to you, three images. One of the Vilna Ghetto Theater on the far left, one, a ghetto theater poster in which in section 2, we can see Sutzkever's name mentioned as someone who has won a ghetto prize. And 3, an image of the famous teacher Mira Bernstein, who would become the subject of his, perhaps one of his most famous Holocaust lyrics, Die Lehrerin Mira, teacher Mira, speaking in the ghetto at the time. And perhaps we see here another example of that linking of cultural and physical resistance in the only poem that he mentions of his in the ghetto memoir, a poem called Take Up Arms. And I managed to find a handwritten copy of that when I was in Vilnius at the time. And then the most famous picture perhaps of him and Shmerka Kaczerginski, both of whom were writers in the ghetto and both of whom were also part of the United Partisan Organization. The closest he comes, I think, to collective self-critique in describing these two worlds is when he warns readers that those present at the moment could not always judge things rationally. So I think, in short, since the liquidation of Vilna was total by the time he returned and was finishing this memoir, he was unwilling, even unable, in the summer of 1944 to evaluate decisions made in extremis. Such judgment would be a perverse diversion from the real perpetrators. The task of rebuilding the Jewish people and bringing Nazi criminals to justice would have to take priority. Since Sutzkever saw himself as committed both to the spiritual resistance and to the physical resistance, as a partisan poet, and since he had deep investment in both worlds, the Chronicle does not limit his understanding of resistance to armed struggle. In fact, I think it's important that he offers dozens of pages about the cultural resistance of Vilna Jewry in wartime, from its literary evenings to theater performances, from its schools to libraries, from its youth clubs to its child art prodigy and its mathematician and its opera star. His own contributions to these activities are mentioned, but are severely downplayed in order to call more attention to the acts of others. And in the slide that you have here, I found this diary of his at the National Library in Jerusalem, where the Sutzkever, part of the Sutzkever archive is. The Sutzkever Kaczerginski archive, of course, is in YIVO in New York, but the Sutzkever archive, his personal archive, is at the National Library. And I hadn't known that this diary existed. And what's fascinating about it is that on these 2 pages, we see the initial notes for his entry on Itzik Wittenberg, who had been the head of the United Partisans organization and then was arrested by the Gestapo. And depending on who which historian believe, either was murdered by the Gestapo or took his own life before he could be murdered before them. I think we also see in this chronicle the anticipation of several trends in Holocaust studies that would not occur until decades after the event. I'll call our attention to one of those, and that's the attention it provides to the role of women in the ghetto, especially in the resistance. The text notes acts of spiritual and cultural steadfastness over and over, focused not only on men, but on women. For instance, when his mother continues reciting the blessing over the Sabbath candles, even when a Nazi collaborator bursts into her home, or when the singer Lyuba Levitsky trains for an opera at the Ghetto Theater, but is captured and tortured only hours before she's scheduled to take the stage, or when teacher Mira Bernstein protects her students during a nighttime raid by hiding them under the stage and leaving herself exposed. He's in awe of women who give birth in the ghetto and nurse their infants in secret. He points out gestures of selflessness that could have cost non-Jewish women their lives, whether it be those of his rescuer Yanova Bartoshevitz taking him into her home, or that of the Mother Superior who hid Abba Kovner and others in her convent, or the Lithuanian librarian Ona Shimaite who hid Jewish books and archival materials and came to the ghetto herself to celebrate May Day. And of course, also women who were partisans, whether they were Wittke Kempner, who participated in the first partisan operation against the German occupation forces, or student Asya Big, who was a liaison officer, or communist activist Sonia Madeisker, who helped found the United Partisan Organization. I think in all these ways, Sutzkever's memoir, crafted in 1944, provides the very preliminary scaffolding for study of gender and the Holocaust, especially the different manifestations of women's resistance. Sutzkever's memoir is also helpful in reminding us that expressions of revenge were common in Yiddish sources composed for Jewish readers, in ways that post-war Holocaust literature written in non-Jewish languages was often not, and usually for reasons of decorum. And we see here a picture of Sutzkever testifying at the Nuremberg Trials in 1946. And I thought that would be a good moment to read a short section of another piece of the volume. And this includes an essay that he wrote many years later about his friendship with Ilya Ehrenberg. And I'll just quote from certain parts of it. I knew Ehrenberg during the good years, when his words were like flaming foxes running through the battlefields, igniting hatred and a demand for vengeance against the Germans. In his strong desire for vengeance, he included his hatred for everything, including his own demons. His powerful articles against the Germans in Germany, later collected in several volumes under the title War, contributed significantly to the victory over the enemy during the Second World War. He loved to quote himself, and he used to say, the writer must not only answer for his every word, he must also answer for his silence. Answering for silence is markedly more difficult than answering for what has been said or written, especially now when silence is sealed with a layer of earth. Nobody knows what the laws of the world to come have to say about the penalty for remaining silent during this lifetime. The poet Shmuel Halkin was correct when, upon his liberation from a camp, he said, quote, the anguish of silence exceeds the anguish of crying out, end quote. In February 1946, I appeared as a witness at the International Tribunal in Nuremberg. Again, I had Ehrenberg to thank for this. He and Solomon Michoels suggested my candidacy. Ehrenberg had previously attended several sessions of the trial as a journalist. He had been shocked by the expressionless Germans who only yesterday were masters of the world. He was no less disgusted by their defense. On several occasions, he related episodes from Nuremberg in which he had asked a German journalist, do you still offer a Heil Hitler with an outstretched arm as a greeting? And his interlocutor would respond with idiotic sincerity, no, now that's forbidden. In the nightmarish days before I flew to the trial in Nuremberg, a fascinating thought occurred to me. Shoot Goering at the trial. Since I still had my revolver from my time in the forest, along with 6 unused bullets, I could easily bring it with me. And according to Ehrenberg, aside from a marshal who was stationed next to the bench holding the accused, I was under the impression it was possible to get within a meter of the defendants. I was possessed by the idea as if by a dibuk, and there was no Rebbe in Moscow to exercise it. With every minute, it took more concrete form, and I worked out a precise plan, down to the last detail, about how to put a bullet into Goering. I didn't tell my plan to anyone. I was careful not to reveal even the slightest hint of it to my wife. In the end, I decided to probe Ehrenberg's soul. After all, he had suggested me as a witness. Very carefully, as if I was speaking regular words without any special intention, I said to him, "You know what I'm thinking, Ilya Grigoryevich? Isn't there a witness to appear at the Nuremberg trial who could shoot Goering?" Ehrenberg measured me with the penetrating wisdom of his glance. I don't know whether he completely understood what I was getting at, but I certainly felt that he knew I was up to something. He responded calmly with drawn out syllables. "If you," he said, "for instance, Avrom Sutzkever, were to do such a thing, what would you accomplish? Nobody would believe that you shot Goering at your own initiative. The Russians would accuse you of having perpetrated the act at the request or at the instruction of the Americans, and the Americans would contend that you carried out a Russian order. Don't forget, you're a Soviet citizen." His answer disarmed me. I did not bring the revolver and the 6 bullets with me to Nuremberg. A Yiddish poet taking revenge on a German supreme commander was not to be. So a few concluding remarks about the memoir, and then I can certainly open it up and talk with Karen and take your questions. One, I think it was important for me in translating this, especially to preserve the fact that it was written for a Yiddish-speaking audience initially, at a time when Yiddish place names had literally been wiped off the map. I sought to produce a translation that respected the city's Yiddish toponymy, because I think it's important to remember that Jewish geography isn't only about material space, but also reflects political and psychic claims and conditions that are registered in language. So I wanted to provide a sense for the way Sutzkever and his fellow Vilners navigated and then reconstructed in its aftermath their Vilna, their Yiddish Vilna. His Yiddish place names remind us of how consciously Jews deployed them to claim urban space for Jewish collective memory. And finally, I think most importantly and most interestingly, previous translations of this text into German or Russian or French or Hebrew limit themselves to the Chronicle itself, that is, to the memoir itself. Mine does not. First, I highlight the differences between the Moscow and Paris editions in order to, in a way, create a synthesized edition. And more importantly, I seek to expand the scope of the memoir by also including Sutzkever's testimony at Nuremberg, Sutzkever's diary notes of his testimony at Nuremberg, and then 3 essays about his time in Moscow, which allow the reader a sense of the political and cultural environment in which he surrounded himself at the very time that he was writing this memoir and then trying to get it published. So we see here a picture of Sutzkever standing with many familiar faces, not only right beneath him Peretz Markish, but also Itzik Pfeffer, also David Bergelsen, also Chaim Graden. Of course, several of them would be murdered by Stalin within a few years. So I think that is enough to provide us with a sense of where the memoir fits into his oeuvre. And if any of you are interested in reading more, of course, it's available for sale, and I've arranged to provide you with a 20% discount if any of you want to. I leave that on the screen. Otherwise, I think I can stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Justin, and for deciding for this background and for deciding to read those fascinating excerpts. I cannot recommend this more highly. Just an absolutely fascinating, like you said, the way that you've connected the contexts and the memoir. And I wanted to start by inviting people to type questions in the chat area, or if you don't want to type your full question, type like, I would like to ask a question. And that way, after I ask 2 or 3 questions that I have prepared for Justin, then we can come to you. Okay, and then there's a question. I wonder, is that something, I mean, there are many places to buy it, but Justin, would you be willing to respond to, while I formulate this question, to the question about a link? Is that
Yeah,
possible?
let me see if I can draw that up and cut and paste it in 2 seconds.
So,
absolutely.
you know what though, because I'm asking you a question, I don't want to distract you. That wasn't right. We'll get, I'll get to it myself while you're answering. So, so connected to your discussion of how much of this memoir Sutzkever dedicates to reflecting on and kind of reminding people of making sure people know about the role of art as resistance. I wanted to ask you a question about Sutzkever's almost mystical relationship with writing. So it plays just an almost unbelievable role in his life, writing poetry. It sustains him in impossible ways. He's able to write when it would seem to be absolutely humanly impossible. And that writing during the time of his World War II experiences not only bears witness, but also continues to believe, continues to hope. I mean, most of us wouldn't, to believe in another time, another age, to believe in Jewish continuity. And I wanted to give an example of a poem he wrote during that time, and say that this relationship he has with the sustaining power of the text seems to give him the quality of a kind of tzaddik who transcends time and space through his connection to Jewish words. So if I could share this for a moment, I wanted to ask you to reflect on that. So I know these are small, but I'm going to read from the bottom corner here. This is I Lie in a Coffin, a very powerful poem written at the same time as the memoir you're discussing. And he finishes it, Azoi is a poem der Seder, hein do, morgen dort, und itzt in den Ohren wie in hilzener Kleider, singt alt noch mein Wort. I can leave the poem off if you want, but how do you understand Sutzkever's ability to sing, to write poetry, to believe in poetry in these circumstances?
Well, it's something that was established before the war, and this is the most amazing thing. That he even as a 25, 26, 27-year-old poet, he knew who he was before he encountered this most amazing and horrific experience. And his belief in Yiddish poetry was such that, in a way, the transition from freedom to utter slavery meant that his faith in Yiddish did not diminish, but in fact was enhanced during ghettoization. So how to frame this a little bit more clearly. He publishes a book in 1940, right, in Vilna, when Vilna is still an island of stability, even though Warsaw is already under occupation. And you would think, what would a poet, a Yiddish poet, publish in 1940? Well, Sutzkever publishes a book that's the most amazing hymn to the powers of Yiddish that you can possibly imagine, completely ignoring the political context around him at a time. There's one line there where he says, you know, every moment is a hymn he's writing in this work that's really about a forest man, about disappearing into the forest and celebrating nature. Very soon after this book's publication, the Soviets come in, and he has to readjust to sort of the censor. Then the Soviets leave, then the Soviets come back, and of course, then the Germans come. And I think that his priorities were always with the master of the Yiddish word, rather than with the terrestrial master. That wasn't his concern. So this poem in particular is quite interesting because Karen and I were discussing a little bit before everyone came on. In the Chronicle, he actually describes the inspiration for where this poem comes from. At a certain point in the initial days of the ghetto, he's looking for a place to go and to hide. And a lot of Jews thought that the safest place to be would be in the courtyard of the Judenrat. And he goes and asks for a place to be. And he can't necessarily join a work brigade, but the same place is hosting the burial society. And there are all these coffins lying around. And he actually describes himself hiding and spending the night in a coffin. This becomes sort of the skin that he's talking about. But I think it's also important to remember that the same word is used for coffin as it is for holy ark. right? Or, different meaning. So what is this? Is this a coffin that he's hiding in? Or is it actually the way of spiritually surrounding himself with his thoughts so that he can transform what otherwise would be this most terrifying experience into the opportunity for poetry? So I think that's like that's the one way that I would start to describe that he's able to take certain moments and transform them from the prosaic into the poetic so that they have lasting meaning. So for instance, in one of his most famous other poems, the lead plates of the Rome press, right, where he talks about partisans burning down the plates of the famous Rome press that not only printed the Talmud, but also major works of Hebrew and Yiddish literature in the 19th century, and using them for bullets. This was a visionary poem, but it never happened. It didn't happen. And in the memoir, we know it didn't happen because he describes how those lead plates of the Rome press were sold by the Germans for a very small amount of money. So how do we, does that mean that the poem is a lie? Well, David Roskies would write, no, it just means that the truth of his vision is truer than the actual reality that he experienced. And that makes it even more interesting, that he's able to take a kernel from something that was real and in the poetry transform it into something that we would still be talking about today. So I think, Karen, that poem that you quote about, it's that intersection between death and life, right? He's hiding in a coffin, which is normally the last place that people go. And it becomes the birthplace for innovation, for generation. And that becomes, an amazing moment.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And it reminds me of another thing that really just took me so by surprise in this memoir. You mentioned that it wasn't praised or published in English because it wasn't considered aesthetic. It wasn't his artistic production like the poems. It was a factual testimony commissioned by the Soviets and maybe treated like a relic by Sutzkever himself. But in the middle of it, we find an astonishing collection of short character sketches that sort of emerge almost like Hasidic wonder tales. Sutzkever tells of individuals with powers that allow them to do the impossible. These are called the Fantastic Cave, the Mathematician, the 9-year-old Artist. And the Fantastic Cave is a labyrinth of tunnels and basements that Gershon Avramovich digs for his mother, and his feats of digging and continually transporting her to safety are impossible to believe, and they remind of the tunnels through which the Baal Shem Tov might travel underground to Eretz Israel. The mathematician becomes like a Spinoza, whose mathematical contribution is going to live on in European thought, and the 9-year-old artist Zalman Bach. And these are true stories. The 9-year-old artist Zalman Bach is like a kind of a child tzaddik of some kind whose artistic gift, removes him from that context, somehow allows him to survive. So I'm interested in this tension that you started talking about just now between realism and myth. And in some way, the stories become like additions to some new scripture that he imagines will live on after the destruction. Could you reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll reflect on it in two parts, because at first, the first part of your question, you alluded to the fact that it's amazing that no one has really paid much attention to this text, and then you came to the kernel of your question. So the first part of it, I think, is no one paid attention to this because Sutzkever didn't want people to pay attention to it, and I think he didn't want people to pay attention to it for particular reasons. One, I think he thought that poetry and his symbolist fiction was at such a higher level that he wanted to be remembered as a poet, and that anything perhaps more prosaic would be a distraction and perhaps deflect from the myth that he was creating that you just mentioned. But I think more importantly was the fact that it was composed in the Soviet Union, and that before he leaves the Soviet Union and before he after he testifies at Nuremberg, he wins a medal. He's awarded a medal for partisan defense, a Stalin medal with a portrait of Stalin. And he's later denounced by other, I don't know why my computer looks like it's going to go off in a second. If you lose me, hopefully it'll come back on. Here, I'm going to
Justin, are you back?
Okay, I'm back. Sorry.
Great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Hoping that it doesn't go off again. I got a message. There's something going on with the college email system, but
Of course.
it should get us, of course, just when we're doing this,
Yeah,
right?
of course. No worries.
So the Soviet context of this, he knew that he was writing this under Soviet, let's say, direction. And there were certain things he could say and certain things he couldn't say. And in fact, because of the publication of this memoir, he couldn't get into the United States. He couldn't get a visa into the United States to speak after the war because he was denounced as someone with ties to the communist regime in the Cold War period. In fact, when he wanted to reunite with Max Weinreich of YIVO, he had to do it in Montreal in 1952. And Weinreich had to travel from New York because Sutzkever could only get a visa to go to Canada and not to the United States at that time. So that's one issue of sort of perhaps the Soviet context was something that as the Cold War increased, people didn't want to deal with. I think on the other issue, the issue of the mythopoetics of people, you're absolutely right that he's crafting here not this individual experience, but taking sort of the showcase of what to him was Vilna society, right? What others call the genius of place, right? That for all of its huge numbers in Warsaw, what Vilna possessed in this much smaller community was this genius of place that would encourage these unbelievable individuals, whether it be Sam Bach, who of course is still alive and doing his art, and now there's a Sam Bach museum in Vilna, or whether it be this amazing mathematician, or whether it be these opera singers, of course, all of them functioning in Yiddish. This is the point that he's trying to make, that this amazingly rich Yiddish culture was also part of the Yiddish culture of the ghettos. And of course, you point out these things that we might otherwise never know, namely how did these hiding places underground look? These amazing descriptions of not only sort of cellar hiding places, but one hiding place that seemed to have a moving sidewalk that was electrified, and that they managed to figure out a way to bring electricity down into the ghetto by siphoning it off from other places so that if it were cut by the Nazis, it would still be able to come down into the ghetto. These are unbelievable moments that we don't get. And in translating this memoir, what I was trying to do, I think, was to, perhaps for the American English reader, displace the centrality of Auschwitz in our cultural imaginary as sort of the central geography of the Holocaust. Not that Auschwitz and Treblinka and other places like it aren't important, but to refocus on the fact that for many Jews, especially Vilna Jews who were not deported like Warsaw Jewry, many of them lived in the ghetto for a significant period of time and then died within walking distance of their homes. And this is also a geography of the Holocaust that we need to pay attention to. So here we have a very, very nuanced and granular depiction of the ghetto experience. Now, it's not a diary, right? We have diaries of the Vilna Ghetto. We have Yitzhak Rudashevsky's diary. We have Herman Kruk's diary. These are amazing primary sources. So I would say that this is a primary source at once removed, right? It's a memoir, but it's not a memoir in which the writer has had time to reflect. It's a memoir that's written right at the very moment and almost breathless. So it's in between the Holocaust diary and the later Holocaust memoir at that very moment where people are trying to figure out, like Sutzkever, what is possible to write at this moment while war is still happening, right? War is still going on in 1944 when he's writing this. What is the most important thing to say for a worldwide or to a worldwide Yiddish readership? What is the relationship between history and memory? What is my responsibility, as Karen says, to create sort of a mythical reading of this experience as opposed to simply a factual reading of this? All of these things you see him wrestling with at one and the same time.
So we have this question which connects a little bit to this. The narrative thrust of the first scene you read was incredible. Did Sutzkever publish many other descriptive passages like that? He seems to write brilliantly. That's what the book consists of.
Yeah, the whole memoir are basically those descriptions.
Mind blown.
And what he does, interestingly, is that he doesn't need to provide the background of Vilna. He assumes that Yiddish readers know what Vilna was and what it represents. So the first page of the memoir immediately charges right into the memoir itself. Doesn't give anyone a chance to sort of, it's almost, you're confronted with it. He begins with the bombing of the city and his running to Noach Palutsky, who's holding the chair in Yiddish studies at the university, and asking him what they're going to do, and the effort to run away. It also provides us with this understanding that the Vilna Ghetto doesn't come about right away. There's almost a month and a half between the time of the establishment of the ghetto and ghettos in early September 1941 and the Nazi occupation of the city. So what's happening there? You know, people disappearing off the streets, kidnappings. Sutzkever spends several weeks in hiding under his mother's roof without any air, writing as much as he can, or as his, and sort of trying to survive and not succumb to the heat, the July heat. Then he describes the ghetto experiences. One of the ghettos will be liquidated almost as quickly as it's established. We're very quickly introduced to Jews spending time at the local prison. We're introduced to the reality of Ponar, where many Jews would meet their fate if they happen to be in Vilna. So all of this is compressed into that first chapter, even before we get to the ghetto. And then the middle chapter sort of introduced the experience of the ghettos, both on a cultural, organizational, and resistance frame. And then the final chapter will provide us with a sense of liberation and what it was like to actually work for those unfortunate few, those who had to work in Ponar and burn Jewish bodies, and then dig up Jewish bodies and burn them again to conceal any evidence of the crimes. I mean, it's extremely graphic. And I think an important document that I thought would be helpful, not only in my teaching of Holocaust history, but also Holocaust literature, and to sort of put those two things in tension with one another.
I'd like to invite a question from Jeffrey Mallow. Oh, you're muted.
I think if I understood what you said, Sutzkever tried to separate his poetry from his actual prose writings, not as writing, but as biography and autobiography. And I can think of one work where he actually put one into the other, and that's Green Aquarium,
Yes.
which is surreal. But right in the middle, as I recall, there's 1 or 2 chapters where he explains exactly what's happening. Is that correct?
I think your description is correct, and of course, there's a beautiful new translation of Green Aquarium done earlier this. Oh, you're holding it up. Sutzkever Essential Prose. So a little bit confusing. The Sutzkever Essential Prose is actually not all of his essential prose; it's his essential fictions, and that differs from the book that I've translated with which is also prose, but that's his memoir and other essays that he wrote. But I think you're right that in those Green Aquarium stories, many of these are surreal and based on those experiences. And I'm not sure we should take them as historically reliable. I think that he's really elevating not only his own experiences. Remember, in one of the first stories of Green Aquarium, he talks about the angel of art coming to him and providing him with sort of really a bargain, saying if your art is good, then I'll keep you alive, and if it's not, you're done for. So the stakes for Sutzkever when it comes to fiction and poetry, I think, are very different than the stakes when he's engaging with prose. And even though those stories that you mentioned are prose, they're really sort of such elevated prose that more than one scholar has talked about them, in fact, as almost prose poetry in some ways.
And you bring up the point that this is kind of a huge moment for English language publications around Sutzkever. So we've talked about your own the one that was referred to here. So the
Zachary
surrealistic
Berger.
essential prose translated by Zachary Schellenberger just came out in 2019, I believe, or now. And then the full Pomegranate, which is bilingual, translated by Richard Fine. And then there were two documentaries, one by the Yiddish Book Center, Wer wird bleiben, which is all, oops, I don't have a, you first. Oops, I don't have a, you first.
Oh, you froze a little bit.
Yeah, okay, I thought you guys was. Is that already out available somehow from the Yiddish Book Center of Erfurt Bleibman? And it leads to the question, what's the significance right now for audiences? Why this explosion of scholarship and productivity around Sutzkever's work? Hello? Okay. I don't know whether the connectivity problems I'm having are at my end. So, Tom, I'm going to ask you, would it be possible for you to take questions?
Can you still hear me? Because everyone's.
I don't know whether the connectivity problems I'm having are at my.
Justin, we can, we could hear you, but I don't really see you.
Tom, I mean, would it be possible for you to take questions?
Yeah. Yeah. Can anyone hear me still?
Yes.
Justin, are you with us?
He's frozen.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I will mention as we wait for Professor Cammy that this is, this may have already come through, a particularly productive year in Sutzkever scholarship and translation. Whoops, is that Justin?
Still frozen.
Well, we'll just wait then, another couple minutes. In Sutzkever scholarship. Oh, so unfortunate.
Can you actually hear me now?
Yeah. In translation.
Can you actually hear me now? I'm back. Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Is anyone else there?
Yes, and we miss you. So
I'm on my
why?
cell phone. Were
So
you- that connectivity issue, or was it just me?
Connectivity.
Connectivity. All right. Well, you have me on the cell phone. We'll see how long this
thank you
lasts.
for getting on this cell phone. An interesting period for Sutzkever scholarship. Why now?
Well, I think he's a great writer, and I think that first of all, he died in 2010, and oftentimes there's a period of retrospective after an author's death that allows for certain things to come about. I'm not sure whether Sutzkever would have given permission during his lifetime for this to be published, and thankfully his daughter and granddaughter gave permission to do this. So that's one reason. And I think that younger people, for whatever reason, what's amazing is that a lot of my work focuses on this idea of when Yiddish was young, that is trying to transform the idea of Yiddish in the popular imagination from something that is related to the past, to destruction, to grandparents, to something that allows young people to understand that this was a civilization that was a youthful civilization. People hiked in Yiddish, people made love in Yiddish, people had youth clubs in Yiddish. There was this incredible world that was all conducted in Yiddish. And frankly, I'll give you two stories about this, and I can't still trying to figure it out myself. during COVID, when all of us went online, I thought, what type of seminar could I give that might inspire students? I was like, well, I know Sutzkever fairly well. Maybe I'll do a Sutzkever seminar for students, and also assume that, wouldn't be so many students who would register for it during this huge pandemic. It was sold out. How many students nowadays at an undergraduate college would take a course called The Last Great Yiddish Poet? But they needed poetry in their lives, especially at a moment of crisis like the pandemic. This coming semester, I'm offering a course on Yiddish literature. And again, the enrollment cap, I can't make enough space in it. There's more than 25 students who want to take the class. So I think Sutzkever plays into a broader interest in recovering experiences, alternative histories of the past, right? And this is not, I'm very interested, obviously, and committed to the teaching that I do about Israel and Zionism, and I'm doing it right now. But I think there's also the Jewish community and frankly, scholarship has not necessarily done a great job in providing other Jewish experiences that existed in the past. And when European Jewry was oftentimes talked about in its contemporary period, oftentimes it always ended with the Holocaust. Sutzkever provides us with this link of talking about a world when he's young, a world of destruction. But then we have to remember, most of Sutzkever's career, almost 50 years, is after the Holocaust, when he's an established poet in Tel Aviv and tries to rebuild Yiddish life and Yiddish connections. That's where the more than 24 volumes that he publishes over the course of his career come out. So I think for me, this ability to look at a writer and teach about a writer who has roots in Europe, experiences the war, and then rebuilds Yiddish Jewish life in the land of Israel and in the state of Israel, almost brings in the entirety of modern Jewish experience. And students relate to that. What does it mean to be a writer, a Yiddish writer in a Hebrew environment? What does it mean to be a refugee? What does it mean to be a witness? And, he doesn't only write about the war. I think that's also really refreshing. Although this book and this talk is about that, his poems about his journeys to Africa, his diary pages about what it means to grow old. These are all things that I think really resonate with readers. And I'm not surprised that there's this new interest in Sutzkever. And did you mention Heather Valencia's translation as well?
Which one?
The one, Sing My Word Sing.
No, please do.
So that's another new translation of Sutzkever, that on top of The Fine and on top of the 2 documentaries and on top of Zachary Sholem Berger's and on top of my translation, we also have Heather Valencia, who's a wonderful interpreter of Sutzkever, publishing another bilingual edition in Europe of Sutzkever. So now we have, between the Harshav translation and the Fine translation and the Valencia translation, not to mention earlier translations, we can recover a lot of what had not been available in Sutzkever. What's interesting is that there are certain things that still aren't translated. And I think we're awaiting poetry translators. We don't have a really great translation of his ghetto poem called Nidre. We don't have a great translation of his ghetto poem, Kever Kin, Grave Child. And we don't have a great translation of his epic poems, the ones that he wrote after the war, either the one about the description of the establishment of Israel or the poem about Jews hiding in the sewers underneath the ghetto. So lest that all the work has been done in this sort of moment of, let's say, translation, there's a lot more work to do for people out there.
And so you are, I just want to make sure, Tom, is Justin highlighted, spotlighted? And so you're highlighting just the incredibly valuable contribution you've made to translation as this central factor in Jewish continuity, Jewish cultural continuity, and revival. We have time for, let's say, 5 more minutes, I would say, and another question. And is that a hand from Jeffrey?
Yeah, it's a very simple question. In one of your early slides, I saw, I think there were 3 parts. To the left was maybe Vilna. The middle was musikalischer Programm. And part one was Mendele Moiches Schwarem, to which I say what? What's that doing in me?
I think the Sutzkever was responsible for putting some of the ghetto theater materials together. And in fact, some of them were put to music. So there were sort of skits that were based on some of these materials. So it's not surprising that in addition to a symphony orchestra or quartets that were often present there were also skits based on classic Yiddish literature, in addition to poetry readings and all those. This was not uncontroversial. Remember that the Bund put out leaflets when the ghetto theater first started performing.
Oh, you're frozen.
Cemetery.
Ah, there you are.
I'm frozen.
You're unfrozen.
I'm unfrozen. That's a good thing. Did you get my answer or no?
Yeah, I did, but I'm still trying to imagine a Mendele Moiches Schwarem song.
I wish I had the lyrics for you.
Well, I want, in the absence of further questions from the audience, I just want to thank you for sticking through. Your energy continues across these interruptions and breaks. And just want to thank you so much for this enormous effort and this contribution, and for talking to us about it. And we look forward to being able to invite you in the future in person. But thank you for joining us online. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
No, Karen, thank you. Thank you all so much. I'm so sorry for these technical problems, but in a way, perhaps it communicates the starts and stops of how Sutzkever has been interpreted over time. And hopefully we're going to get into smoother waters. And I always welcome your comments. So if anyone reads the whole book and has further comments, please do send me emails to Smith College, and I'll answer them. Thank you so much.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Seid gesund. Till next time.
Good night. Have a